Professor Iring Koch from RWTH Aachen University's Department of Psychology in Germany. Professor Koch research focused on cognitive control, how we direct our attention, language, and action, and so on. And he explored topics like multitasking, task switching. Professor Koch is also an editor and board member for several international journals, such as Journal of Cognition, Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance. In recent years, Professor Koch also collaborated closely with Professor Xie. And today, Professor Koch will talk about cognitive flexibility in attention, action, and language. So now let's welcome Professor Koch.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And let's see how I can manage this. Okay. Yeah, I would also like my collaborators here at Tainan, Chu Lanqi and Chun Huang, with whom we had a project, bi-national project funded by the Forschungsgemeinschaft, which means German Research Council, and the Ministry of Science and Technology. Now it's called differently. Now it's the National Science and Technology Council, which also pays my travel costs for this travel. And my colleague, Stefan, her costs were covered by university funds. I understand this correctly. And in the framework project, we are interested in cross-modal processing and age-related changes in performance. I will not focus too much on this part. This will be done later by my colleague. My talk will be a bit more general, but before I start, I will show you a map of Central Europe. And this is Germany, so this is UK. Here you will see London, for example. Here is France, and this is Paris. And it's very small, yeah. And here, basically, is Aachen. It's a bit bigger, so here's still London. And somewhere here should be Brussels. Here is Aachen, and here is Frankfurt, where we took the plane to come to Taiwan. Here you see a different map, but you see it's a bilingual map. So it's Brüssel, that's German, and Bruxelles, that would be the French name. And also Aachen has a French name, and that's Aix-la-Chapelle, and chapelle means chapel, means church, means cathedral. And this is what we have, this nice cathedral, and you can see this lower part here with this octagonal tower-like structure. This is from the year of 800, so really old. We also have a very modern part. This is Gothic from 14th century. So it's really nice. And there's a market square at the back, and there's also a market square at the other side. And this is our medieval town hall. So it's a nice old city, not very big, but by your standards, probably this college has 250,000 inhabitants. But our university is the biggest university of technology in Germany, and it has roughly 45,000 students. We also have two universities of applied sciences, so we have basically more than 70,000 students in a city with 50,000 inhabitants. So it's nice. Okay, but actually today I'm talking about not geography, but about control and attentional and cognitive flexibility. I will introduce some basic concepts, and then I will present you selected findings. I assume I won't have enough time for the bilingual flexibility part, but this is not problematic because later in the afternoon there might be another chance for some of you, and there I will focus on bilingual flexibility. Talking about flexibility, I made a picture. You recognize it probably. That's the high-speed rail. Very impressed. We had 3 trips with the high-speed rail, and departure, arrival and departure exactly on the minute, very precise. So you make your plans, you no flexibility required. When you come visit us in Germany, you will find displays like this, changed order of cars, train today cancelled. I assume you don't need even these display options, but we need them desperately. So this means you need to change plans, you need to adapt depending to current context, circumstances, and you need cognitive control in order to get rid of your previous plans, update your memory, and do something else. This is, of course, also in somewhat less serious situations like here when you have a plan and your opponent has a different plan and you have to adapt. So you need to be flexible. Sometimes you also have simply to stop some behavior and wait until you can restart it. As a final example, while you know this, probably psychology students are taught this in the first year. This is the famous Stroop task. Your task is to name the color of the letters, but incidentally, the letters form a word that you could read. And because reading is well practiced, you do read the word, even though it's not your instruction. And here you would read Blau, which is German for blue. But your task here, obviously, to name the color of the letters. The letters are green, so you would say green, and grün is the German word. You see there are some similarities between German and English. Okay, so these are situations that require strong cognitive control and flexibility to change plan. And we have a number of processes. Well, in terms of psychological context, you would call it vision, selective attention, planning, or shifting, and so on. And this is really the heart of behavior and cognitive flexibility. And if you try to find a name for this concept, then in the old days, people would have called it just the will, or in social psychology, perhaps self-control, or when it comes to overeating in front of a buffet of sweets, then we need self-control. In the attention literature, people have invented the idea of a supervisory attentional system. In working memory research, it's the central executive. And in neuropsychology, people have called it executive functions. But I would claim that these concepts are more or less the same as the concept of cognitive control, which is theoretically a bit more neutral as a term, I would claim. So, so this Stroop-like situation requires strong selective attention. Probably it also requires response inhibition. If your selective attention fails, then you will process too much irrelevant information that might even activate a response. So in this situation, you need cognitive control, and this refers to the higher order that exert biasing influences on attention, cognition, and action in a goal-directed manner. And these processes need to be implemented somehow in the system. And here, researchers have invented the idea that this is an abstract control representation that can be called task set. So this is the actual, the current configuration of mental processes that is needed to perform a certain task. This has a number of core components. So cognitive control is a task set is selected, implemented, shaped, inhibited, or shifted. And according to a well-known taxonomy proposed by Akira Miyake and colleagues, you have these three core components, shifting, updating, and inhibition. You see they are not independent, they are overlapping. And the shifting component is mostly related to flexibility, and this can be examined using versions of task switching. And I'm focusing on the shifting component and will describe the switching methodology in more detail. Why is this research important? Here I show you just some examples. For example, in major depressive disorder, you find broad impairments of cognitive control. Also in other clinical symptoms, like obsessive compulsive disorder, and also in depression, you lose your flexibility. So you suffer from rigidity, so the inability to update your memory content, which leads to rumination and so on. So you just cannot get rid of the ideas that you have once in your mind, and they repeat themselves and you cannot stop them. Also in schizophrenia, and here it's a bit small, but well, in all kinds of psychiatric and neurological disorders like autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and also in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. So cognitive flexibility is really a major clue to understanding psychiatric and clinical symptoms. So typically flexibility is going down. How can this be examined? I would like to present the experimental methodology now. And to put it very simple, so if you have two tasks, I just name them A and B. Later you will see specific examples. In a sequence of tasks, there are task repetition trials, and there are task switch trials. And in the task switch, there is some interference. It's harder to change the task, and this can be measured in terms of behavior, like increased reaction times and this is the so-called switch costs. A few years ago, we published a big review paper where we also related this research to the dual task research, and we found very obvious and strong relations. I would like to give you some specific examples. Arthur Gershild, almost 100 years ago, had participants perform the same task or mental operation over a good number of stimuli in a list. Well, back then it was on a cardboard, the entire list, and the list completion times would be measured. For example, you would get a list, a sheet of paper, let's say, with these numbers, and your task is to add 3, and I would measure how long it takes you. So I would say 21, 29, 44, 48, and so on. So easy. But there was also a condition where the list required 2 different tasks. So the plus task that you know, and an enter generation task means to say the opposite, or cold, so you would say warm. So it's 21, warm, 44, far, 76, top, down. Oh, you see, it's confusing. But there was also a third condition where the stimuli didn't tell you the tasks, and you need to keep in mind what your tasks are, and it's alternating between +3 and -3. So it's 21, 23, 44, 42, 76, and 66. In terms of performance, we found that the core lists or single task condition was fast, so best performance, and the mixed lists or mixed task conditions, task switching conditions, were worse. And depending on the experimental details, the most difficult condition is always when the stimuli themselves don't tell you what task to do, and you need some additional context information to decide what to do with the given stimulus. Yeah. So to summarize this part, In single task conditions, your perform well. These are by definition repetition trials. Performance is typically very good, whereas when you need to switch tasks, performance is not so good. But in mixed task situation, it's also possible to include repetitions. So like in a task sequence, like here, AA, BB, AA, BB. And then the question is, we have repetitions here. Will these repetitions have the same performance level like in the single task condition? And the response is definitely no. So first of all, the difference between switch and repetition in the mixed task is called switch costs. And very interestingly, the repetitions in mixed tasks and the repetitions in single task also differ typically quite strongly. And this mixing costs reflect the your generalness to tasks. So you need to keep active in your working memory a second task, and this slows you down more generally. Okay, I give you another example of how task switching paradigms could look like. And here's an example with a verbal cue, so letter. So you will see a stimulus soon, and it will include a letter. Your task is to focus on the letter and decide whether it's consonant versus vowel. But then you see there's also a digit. And for digit, there's a separate task. It's not the current task, but for the digit task, you would have to decide whether the digit is odd or even. So it was a task. Should I press left or right? G. Is G consonant or a vowel? Consonant, okay. So we see the mapping. So consonant means left key, left key. Okay. The problem is if it was the digit task, the digit 8, is this odd or even? Even, yeah. So then you would have to press the right key. So depending on your task with this particular stimulus, you would have either to press the left key or the right key. And this is indeed a problem, and you typically measure that in this situation, performance is worse when the other task would require a different response given the same stimulus. So in the, this is called a congruency effect or response incongruency. So this now would be a switch trial. So from letter to digit, and then you would have to ignore the letter that was just in the focus of your attention and shift to the digit. Then you also need to apply a different SR mapping that you need, well, stimulus response mapping that you need to activate. People have called this a task set reconfiguration. So you need to change your task goal, you activate the new task rules, and then you can go on. Okay. So in this task, Rogers and Monsell, long time ago, 30 years ago, in a very nice paper, found that the letter task and the digit task produce very similar performance, and also the switch costs are very similar, and the switch costs are very substantial. If you consider that if you take the repetitions as a baseline, this is like a 30% performance impairment, so a huge effect. How can we explain the switch cost? A very simple idea would be that in a task repetition, you have these typical stages of information processing going from perception via cognition, response selection to the motor part, ending in the observable response. And in a task switch, you have exactly the same stages of processing, but you also need to reconfigure your system. You need to change your attention settings. So now ignore the letter, focus on the digit. You need to update your working memory in terms of digit. So even was right key and odd was left key. And then if you have done that, you could go on. And the difference, the time difference, is measured as the switch cost. So a control operation takes some time. So then we could take the switch cost as a measure of task set reconfiguration, so an active control process. But of course, there's also an alternative account, assuming that in a task switch, because the previous task just is active in your mind and remains active, and it's not easy to deactivate it, this will slow down you more generally. So perception will just take a bit longer until you have decided what the target stimulus is. Response selection will take a bit longer because you first need to get rid of the old stimulus response mapping that might still try to process the letter information, even though now it's the digit. And also response execution might take longer because you have maybe both responses activated and need to decide which one is the right one. So in that case, the switch cost would be more a measure of the after effects of the previous task rather than the preparation for the new task. So some people, well, Alan Allport, people we know, he has called that a task set inertia. So like a sluggish mechanism that doesn't like quick changes. Fortunately, there's data showing that switch costs are indeed related to active control processes, and this comes from studies on preparation effects. And already Rogers and Monsell presented some data suggestive of an active control process. And here you see the switch condition in red and the repetition condition in green. This is the difference is the switch costs. Here we examine the switch costs in reaction times as a function of the interval between the response and the next stimulus. They used a predictable task sequence, so you could use this interval to prepare for the new task. And what they found is that indeed switch costs go down very nicely and are reduced by half, roughly. So this suggests that this reconfiguration process apparently can at least be partly done in advance, suggesting that with switch costs we have a marker that really, well, at least reflects in part active cognitive control processes. So we can take it as them as a measure of cognitive flexibility. Okay, so that would be the tutorial part about task switching. And now I would like to present you 2 lines of research in our lab, recent research. And first, do you have questions so far? So this gives you time to digest what you have heard so far. You could also ask questions later, of course, or you can come to me. But I have seen one question in the front. Mm-hmm. Yeah, global costs. I think in one of the early papers, Nachshon Meran has called this alternation costs. This is what Gershild actually did. So he compared single task lists with mixed lists that simply consisted of task alternations. I think this is a very a global index of the performance impairment in such multitasking situations. There are just some conditions in which this is a useful measure. For example, when you have 3 tasks and when you have a paradigm where you focus, for example, on n-2 repetitions, then you don't have immediate repetitions. So you're singled, so your task switching condition just has no repetition baseline that you could use as a comparison condition for the single task condition. And then it is just an index of global control. And I myself think this is reasonable because the difference between mixing costs and switch costs, well, right, purely at the purely methodological level, it seems as if this is a very, well, nice decomposition of the overall costs, but I would not trust it because the task repetition baseline can be very, very variable. So you cannot trust it, and therefore you cannot really be sure that with the mixing costs you measure something completely different than what you have in the switch costs. So I myself would be rather unorthodox here, and I would be flexible and use what is useful in a given situation. But I encounter this sometimes that reviewers are can be fairly strict and want you to stick to terminology and operational definitions, and yeah. Okay, so then I come to the first example on cross-modal visual, auditory, attentional flexibility. And here we use a very, very simple task. We ask subjects to indicate the spatial position of the target stimulus, left or right. So this is really simple. But we presented stimuli in two modalities, visual and auditory, and we gave participants prior to each trial a modality cue telling them whether they should focus on the auditory stimulus or on the visual stimulus. And here in this case, it's spatially congruent. Both are on the left side, so easy. But in this case here, the stimuli are presented on different sides, visually left, auditory right. So here you really need to know what the target modality is. So to identify the target stimulus, because otherwise you would not know which response key to press. And this is, of course, another example of an incongruent stimulus situation. And we can, by comparing this, we can measure the congruency effect. So, and this is now actually research study recently published with our collaborators here, and so I'm very happy to present this here in front of this audience. And this is about age-related differences in such cross-modal situations. So would older adults have disadvantages in doing such cross-modal spatial conflict tasks? And generally, we can assume that with older age, some performance impairments can be observed. And the question is, how can we explain them? And the literature offers, well, broadly, three accounts. One is that processing speed generally goes down, which means that you will observe general slowing in behavior of older adults. Another approach would assume a sensory deficit. So assuming that because older adults see less well, hear less well, typically compared to younger adults, the quality of the sensory signal that they can process is just less well, and therefore they take a bit longer. So that would be a more specific explanation relative to general slowing. And finally, there is the cognitive deficit, primarily the inhibitory deficit hypothesis, assuming that for older adults, it simply gets harder to deal with distractor information. And in that case, we would say, well, we have a strong distractor in the incongruent conditions. How well can participants deal with this situation? and how well can they deal with changing the target modality from visual to modality back and forth. So we have examined this, and so now let's see. These are the data, the reaction times, and to the left you see the data of the young adults, and to the right you will later see the data of the old adults. And here we had a single task condition. I will show you the data soon. Repetition, so the mixed blocks, repetition and switch. And here you see the switch costs. There's also the congruency effect, so the dashed line, the reaction times are longer for the incongruent than for the congruent trials. So here you see the data of the older adults. You see the switch costs, so the difference between repeat and switch is about the same, but they're generally much slower. Now, for the young adults, these are the single task condition, and hence this would reflect the mixing costs. So there are obviously clear mixing costs. And the question is, how would the mixing cost look like for the older adults? And here you see that the mixing costs are really strongly increased, or to put it differently, the general slowing is much less pronounced in the single task condition, but as soon as you add a second task, and as soon as the older adults, roughly, I think, mean age of 70, as soon as they have to juggle with two tasks, so to have another task in their working memory that they need to keep active and shift between tasks, even if they don't shift, the readiness to shift a task slows them much more down than the young adults. And this work has been done by Ludivine Schiltz, our Belgium PhD student. As you might have seen, Aachen is located directly to the very west, the westernmost city in Germany, and it's really located basically at the border, almost on the border to the Netherlands and Belgium. Okay, so what does it mean? We have an age-related increase in the global mixing costs in cross-modal attention switching, but the switch costs, so switching per se, is not impaired in older age, which is apparently not in line with the general slowing account and the sensory deficit account. And it suggests that in older adults, we have a more general reduction in cognitive flexibility. So it's not the switching itself that is impaired, but the readiness to switch is impaired. And this suggests a more specific cognitive explanation. So you can ask questions now or later. And then I come to the next example. And this is about auditory attention. And this is a cocktail party as it was apparently common in the high society 70 years ago in the United States. But obviously we still have very often situations in which many people are talking at the same time, and we are required to focus on a target speaker and try to suppress all the distracting noise and background speech. So this is a difficult situation, so selective listening is required, and we are studying this in our lab, also with a very simple paradigm. So participants sit in front of a monitor, have to press left and right response key, and they hear two voices, a female and a male voice, saying a number word, for example, 9 and 3, and you get a visual cue that tells you what the target voice is. So F, let's say for female, so 9 would be the target voice, your target stimulus, and you would have to ignore 3. And your task is to decide whether the target word is smaller or larger than 5, very simple. So you know 9 is larger than 5. You can count up to 10. So this is really easy task. So here you press the right key. Easy. However, you hear at the same time the destructor word. And that's the 3, which would require, with smaller than 5, a left key press. So this is, again, an example of an incongruent trial, and we can compute the congruency effect. But of course, we could also, and we are most interested in measuring the costs of changing your attentional bias from attending to the female voice to attending to the male voice. And this way we can measure the attention, the auditory attention switch costs or shift costs. So yeah, I think that's, again, we are interested in age-related differences in processing and measuring it in performance. These are the 3 that you have learned already. And yeah, I should say sensory deficit. Well, you know that with older age, hearing gets less well. You lose the high frequency components of the signal you hear, while your world is a bit more muffled. So this is the age-related hearing loss. If that gets pathologic, then you would need hearing aids. We examined performance of young adults, older adults that don't use hearing aids, so that don't have this strong hearing loss. And it's about selective listening. So actually, I could just continue my talk and you know exactly what the problem is.
各位同学有听到黄河一同学，你可以把麦克风关掉吗？
Are there different rooms?
I don't know.
哎，去那个图。奇怪，静音静音，为什么其他都静音就好？
Yeah, I somehow need to find. Okay, so now now it's frozen. Okay, so I'm back. Yeah. Okay. So let's see the data. These are the data of 47 young adults, roughly 22 years old. And you see there was no single task condition. This is repeat, and this is switch, and this is the switch cost. And there were 2 sessions. We had 2 sessions because we thought it would be interesting to study whether older adults maybe have strong, well, trouble in the first session, but they can learn how to adapt to the situation, and maybe they perform much better in a second session. And maybe age-related effects when studied in the lab are simply, well, overestimated because older adults are less experienced with these situations, but with some practice they would catch up. And here we see the young adults, they have clear switch costs, and they improve quite a bit from first to second session. Also the switch cost, so this is a copy of this line, like a bit shifted. Switch costs get a bit smaller, so young adults adapt to the situation, improve. So here you see how the switch costs would be and how they are. But for the older adults, you see again, generally they are much slower, so they take need more time to decide about the target voice and then press the correct response. And also the switch costs are not so much different, but what you see is the performance improvement is a bit smaller, and particularly there is less reduction in switch costs. So this is this line, and you see switch costs are slightly larger, and they don't really improve in terms of reducing the switch costs. So in older adults, selective listening does not get more flexible with practice. And when we look into the error rates, you see that particularly in the incongruent situation, so when the male and the female voice would require different responses, then older adults have particular trouble. Which means that older adults selective listening is more difficult when there is distractor interference. Yeah, this is work by our Italian PhD student Luigi Falanga, and we hope this work will be accepted soon. So we were invited to revise and resubmit the paper. Sensory deficit, age-related hearing loss. Can this explain our findings? We used a correlational approach. And here I show you the hearing thresholds. We did pure tone audiometry. This is for PTA. This is a bit small, I'm afraid, but there will be more panels to come. So this is the reaction time. Reaction time as a function of hearing ability. And to the left, people hear very well. And the more it would go to the right, they would hear not very well. And you see our young adults basically all hear very well. So 20 is basically a threshold. So beyond 20, you don't hear very well. Up to 20, that's just normal. And you see there's no correlation between hearing ability and reaction time in the young adults. But in the old adults, you see hearing ability is much more scattered. So you have some with, well, mild hearing impairment. And we have a very nice correlation of 0.325 with reaction time. But this is really due to two outliers that actually have a hearing impairment at the threshold where they should actually be asked to consider using hearing aids. And if we remove just these two outliers, 47, we remove two data points, we have 45, and the correlation is completely gone, broken down. So interesting lesson for you. Perhaps never trust a correlation. Even with a fairly large sample size of 47, two outliers can produce a correlation that is actually not really there. And if you remove the outliers, nothing left. Yeah. This is the switch costs. So does hearing ability predict the switch cost? We would not expect this for the young adults because there's little variation anyways, but for the old adults, we see there is only a very small correlation, and if this is reduced, it gets even smaller, so basically there's nothing. We have the congruency effect. Maybe this can be explained by hearing loss or hearing ability. Nothing in the young adults, and again, in the old adults, these two outliers produce a correlation of almost 0.38. So this is really a very clear correlation, but you remove these two data points and you end up with 0.063. So basically nothing. So apparently hearing ability, well, unless it is really so extreme that participants have trouble doing the task, hearing ability does not explain our age-related deficits. So this is work by Luigi. Here you see him. Okay, and this really suggests that it's a cognitive deficit. It's impaired flexibility based on reduced plasticity in learning destructor inhibition. So this was a correlational approach. I just wanted to tell you, and the ongoing project with colleagues from technical acoustics department, well, electrical engineering in Aachen, we are working on an experimental hearing loss simulation. So the opposite of what you would, well, if hearing aid you try to simulate better hearing in older adults that have no longer good hearing, well, to make them hear better. And here we try to make young adults hear worse in order to simulate the level of hearing that the older adults have. And then we can compare young adults with and without this hearing loss simulation and can see whether they perform the same or whether the degradation of the sensory signal actually makes their performance go down. But based on our correlational data, we would expect that we just get converging evidence and that even with poorer sensory signals, young participants still do very good, whereas older adults, probably even if you improve their hearing, they would not improve very much in this particular attention, well, selective listening scenario. Okay, so now I'm skipping a part, and I just try to see how to get out here. No. How do I get back to the? So would be really useful to be able to read Chinese. To go out. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So, jumping to conclusions. We talked about cognitive control or executive functions. These enable cognitive flexibility. And I have explained that the core mechanisms underlying this flexibility are shifting inhibition and working memory, updating. And I have also shown in these two examples that in such selective attention situations, particularly if they require flexibility, like task switching, cross-modal target selection, selective listening, then this flexibility declines with age. Flexibility, I have not shown this specifically, but it involves inhibition of competing tasks and languages. That would be a different presentation. And I hope I have also convinced you that the task switching methodology is an important research tool. It's just a general approach that you can use and apply to all kinds of research questions like selective listening or cross-modal processing, or even, well, bilingualism, well, switching from one language to the other. And cognitive flexibility is a key factor across many domains, such as basic cognition, clinical psychology, well, you remember depression, schizophrenia, and so on, cognitive aging, and bilingualism, as you can see perhaps later this afternoon. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you again to Professor Koch. So before we move on to the second talk of the day, does anyone have any questions? Okay, here's the question.
So in one of the study, we found the missing cost in between older adults and younger adults. Missing cost in older adults is way larger, but in switch cost, it seems like there's no difference. So I was interested in that. What do you think that the reason would be that the switching cost is no difference between older adults and younger adults?
Yeah, thank you. So mixing costs versus switching costs. There is a meta-analysis that has shown that when viewed across many studies using many different paradigms and experimental setups, but so very broadly, most studies found age-related increases in the mixing costs. But for the switch cost, the picture is much more variable. Even today, I showed in the first study where we also looked into mixing costs, there was no difference in switch costs. But in another experiment that we have conducted with the same setup, we also found age-related increases in switch costs, but you don't find it regularly. You can find it, but it's not the standard finding. So when you don't find it, you don't have done the experiment wrong, but it's just this is not the most standard finding. In the selective listening task, I presented second. We didn't assess single task performance, so we cannot compute mixing costs. But in this condition, in this experiment, we also found some effects on switch costs. So you can see that this is really a bit variable. And to some degree, the switch costs and the mixing costs index different processes. So no effect is process pure, but I would assume that with the switch costs, the shifting component is a bit stronger, whereas with the mixing costs, the memory updating component is a bit stronger, and probably in both costs you have the inhibition component. And of course, there are more than these three processes, but these are the core processes. And so to me, this suggests that older adults have trouble controlling the content of their working memory. This is for them more difficult than for younger adults, whereas the switching itself also requires control over your selective attention. And this apparently is not so much or not consistently impaired, less consistently impaired in older adults. Thank you.
Okay. 那我们现在休息5分钟后再继续。Okay, thank you.
他们万一就再打开，就不能再开了。可是我不知道那个会不会有人进，只有他而已。那我们不能直接先设定。 My notes. Okay. I'll be back in like 2 minutes. Okay.
你们都在打屁股，你们怎么应该有一个
对，我记得有一个，
说就是强制一定不可以开启啊。你们就是功课都没做好，既然知道要用 Webex， 你要去了解那 Webex 的功能啊。因为你们是主持人，所以有 authority 关掉啊。因为你不知道说还有别人，然后他说显然根本这个人就。